Welcome to a story that feels straight out of an action movie. But every word is true. Can you believe a gate code could cost someone their life? An EMT was tased on the spot while trying to save a life. And it all started with a neighborhood association called HOA Karen. Stick around till the end to see how an entire community rose up, and how one grieving husband turned his loss into a legal revolution. What do you think about what happened? If it were you, would you stand up or stay silent? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because your voice is part of the fight for justice. Natalie Brooks was stunned as a surge of electricity tore through her body. She collapsed onto the cold ground, her breath caught in her throat. Just a split second earlier, Natalie had been trying to support the frail body of Mrs. Martha Green. The stun gun cracked sharply, splitting the air. Natalie's vision darkened as she collapsed next to the woman she was shielding. In the chaos, a terrified scream rang out. Whether it was from Natalie or James, no one could tell, signaling that tragedy had struck. Just minutes earlier, the small street had been quiet under the soft afternoon sun. Natalie and James had come to the home of Frank and Martha Green to investigate ongoing disputes with the Neighborhood Homeowners Association, mockingly referred to by locals as the HOA Karen. The early afternoon calm was shattered when Karen, the president of the HOA, arrived with security guard Derek Slater. Both Natalie and James felt a chill as Karen approached, eyes narrowed with hostility. She stormed forward as if the two guests were an imminent threat that needed to be subdued. Natalie stood near Mrs. Martha on the porch, gently taking her hand as if to reassure her. Martha was trembling, her face a mixture of exhaustion and extreme anxiety. Frank stood in the doorway, his voice hoarse as he explained that his wife was unwell. But Karen ignored him, coldly raising a violation notice and cutting him off mid-sentence. Her shrill voice rang out. The Greens have violated neighborhood regulations, unauthorized plants in the yard, and hosting outsiders without notifying the HOA. Karen's outrageous behavior made James clench his fists in anger. Natalie felt Mrs. Martha's hand grow cold, her body on the verge of collapse. Derek advanced menacingly when Frank refused to step aside. James noticed beads of sweat forming on Martha's forehead, her face pale. He stepped back to the edge of the porch to call an ambulance. Karen continued her tirade, oblivious to the fact that Martha was clutching her chest, gasping for air. Natalie gripped Martha's shoulder tightly, fearing a heart attack was setting in. Natalie pleaded, "She needs her medication, please stop." But Karen dismissed the plea without a hint of sympathy. Her eyes gleamed with cruelty beneath the guise of rule enforcement. She signaled Derek, "Take her out." Immediately, the guard lunged forward, yanking the stun gun from his belt. Natalie was kneeling beside Martha, one hand rummaging through the coat pocket for heart medication, the other supporting Martha's back. Fear and determination to save the elderly woman surged through her. Frank rushed to his wife's side, eyes wide with horror, as he saw Derek aiming the weapon at Natalie. He shouted in desperation, "Don't!" A streak of blue electricity burst forth with a crackling pop. Natalie was thrown back by the jolt, her entire body paralyzed. The hands that had been supporting Martha fell limp. James watched in horror as his colleague collapsed, his phone dropping from his hand onto the porch without him realizing. He dashed forward, only to be blocked by Derek. James had no choice but to step back, helpless and furious. At that same moment, Martha slumped to the ground. She let out a faint gasp before going still, her pale face turning toward the endless sky. Seconds later, the distant wail of an approaching ambulance echoed through the neighborhood. James dropped to his knees beside Natalie, tears brimming in his eyes. Frank cradled his wife's head, his voice choked as he cried, "Martha, wake up!" But there was no response. Martha Green's vacant eyes stared ahead, her frail hand slipping from her husband's grip and falling onto the cold ground. The fragile thread of life within her had been severed. Martha Green drew her last breath in her husband's arms, bringing a bitter and tragic beginning to light, under the dark shadow cast by the HOA, led by Karen. The news of Martha Green's death struck like lightning on a clear day, plunging the entire Orchard Pine Estates community into a state of utter shock. What was once promoted as an ideal retirement haven had now become the eye of a public storm, a community fractured where seemingly harmless rules had turned into deadly weapons. The ambulance left the neighborhood more slowly than usual, Not because of traffic, but because one of the medics had to ride in the back as a victim. Natalie Brooks, still shaken, lay motionless on a makeshift stretcher, her hands curled from the electric shock. Her eyes were wide open, not from physical pain, but from witnessing the worst moment of her 12-year career. She had been there, just a few steps from the patient, and utterly powerless as Martha stopped breathing. As the ambulance pulled away, Frank Green still sat collapsed on his porch steps, clutching his wife's hand as if holding on to the impossible. "They killed her, with those damn rules," he murmured, his voice trembling like ripples across a still lake. Neighbors began to gather, their faces a mix of shock and fear. A phone was raised from the porch next door, and within minutes, video footage of Natalie being tased had gone viral across social media. On the small screen, it was unmistakable. Natalie, in her EMS uniform, holding a trauma bag, shouting to be let through to save a life. Derek Slater, the security guard in a black shirt emblazoned with HOA security, fired without a second thought. "You don't have the gate code," he said robotically, just before pulling the trigger on the stun gun. Less than 3 hours later, the hashtag number Justice for Martha was trending nationwide. Local media exploded. Online news outlets splashed bold headlines. "Elderly woman dies after HOA blocks emergency aid." Tasers, gate codes, and a death that could have been prevented. Reporters began appearing at the gates of Orchard Pine, setting up tripods in what used to be a grand entrance, now more intimidating than ever. An anonymous resident leaked internal HOA emails, revealing that Karen, the HOA president, had personally drafted the no code, no entry, no exceptions policy just 2 months prior. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Natalie was transferred to the neurology wing with a diagnosis of grade 3 nerve damage in her left shoulder from the electric shock. Her hand trembled constantly. Even grasping objects became difficult. But worse than the physical pain was the trauma. Her mind replayed that moment endlessly. Martha collapsing, the crackle of the stun gun, the blank indifference in Derek Slater's eyes. Natalie hadn't just lost a patient. She'd lost her conviction, the right to save lives without being treated like a criminal. James Carter, Natalie's partner, blamed himself for not stopping the tragedy. While Natalie was being taken down, he had still been on the phone with command, requesting permission to open the gate, something that now sounded like a cruel joke. He once believed in protocol, in procedures, but that day, the very system he trusted had killed someone. "I should have kicked that gate down," he muttered through clenched teeth, his voice thick with emotion. Frank Green, now a widower after 50 years of marriage, wasted no time making a decision. He would sue the entire HOA board for negligent manslaughter. He didn't say much, just one sentence. "I don't want their money. I want to make sure they can't kill anyone else." And with that, attorney Rachel Stein entered the scene. Meanwhile, Karen, the one behind it all, had yet to make any appearance. No apology, no official statement. But the residents knew. This was no longer an accident. This was the result of people who believed rules mattered more than lives. Orchard Pine Estates, once a pride of the retirement community, was now rotting from the inside out, because one truth could no longer be denied. When bureaucracy kills compassion, every locked gate becomes a ready-made grave. Orchard Pine Estates was once a tranquil picture of suburban America. Red brick roads winding past pristine white fences, lawns trimmed like golf courses, and golden afternoon sunlight spilling onto porches where elderly couples sipped hot tea. But beneath that polished surface operated a silent machine of control, one that had been running quietly for nearly a decade. And the tragedy of Martha Green wasn't the beginning. It was the inevitable result. It all began 10 years ago, with what seemed like a trivial incident. A few unfamiliar youths broke into the tennis court and spray-painted graffiti on the walls. Then came a model home with its door broken, and a few mailboxes smashed overnight. No one was hurt, nothing was stolen. But for Victor Malone, who had just been elected president of the Homeowners Association, those incidents were a wake-up call. Victor wasn't one to trust easily. A long scar stretching from his cheekbone to his left jaw was a daily reminder of a youth spent in the slums of South Chicago. He had been attacked by a group of muggers on his way home from the corner store. Since then, Victor lived in a state of constant vigilance. When he moved to Orchard Pine with his wife, He thought he had finally found peace. But the first few scratches on that perfect picture triggered his defensive instincts immediately. Instead of calling for community unity, Victor proposed to professionalize neighborhood security. At the time, the HOA board was mostly symbolic, a few elderly residents organizing barbecues and checking lawn height. But Victor turned it into an enforcement engine. An emergency meeting was held. PowerPoint presentations flooded with crime charts and phrases like community insecurity. Few objected. Who wanted to live in a place where you could get sprayed with paint at midnight? The result was a major contract with a local private security firm. Gates were erected, cameras installed at every corner, and uniformed guards began patrolling day and night. HOA fees doubled, then tripled. But Victor needed only one phrase to reassure residents. We're not just protecting property, we're protecting our way of life. Then came the rules. Hundreds of pages of regulations began to appear, detailing everything from flagpole height to the exact color of mailboxes. Anyone entering the community had to be granted a gate code by a resident, even relatives, plumbers, or emergency medical personnel. And if anyone objected, they'd receive a community violation warning, a piece of paper as intimidating as a court summons, especially in the eyes of elderly residents. Under Victor's hand and his loyal inner circle, whom he called the Core Council, Orchard Pine was transformed into a fortress governed by suspicion and fear. Every neighbor became a pair of watchful eyes. Every unfamiliar sound after 9 p.m. became grounds to call security. And Derek Slater, the rigid security guard, was the perfect offspring of that very ideology. Derek, a former mall cop fired for brandishing a baton at a teenage shoplifter, had found his ideal place at Orchard Pine. Here, he wasn't restrained. He was empowered, treated like a full-fledged police officer without training, without licensing, and with only one requirement: follow procedure. To Derek, the gate was a front line, and anyone without a code was the enemy. Martha Green, a devoted wife and kind neighbor, wasn't the first person to be treated harshly by the HOA. A pizza delivery boy had once been left waiting outside the gate for over 40 minutes, resulting in a canceled order. A pregnant woman was denied entry for forgetting her ID, but no one had died until Natalie Brooks showed up in her EMS uniform and was treated like a threat. At the closed-door meeting following Martha's death, one board member whispered, "Haven't we gone too far?" But Victor Malone merely stared out the window, his gray eyes cold and unblinking. He said nothing, because to him, that death wasn't a mistake. It was the necessary cost of order. The problem at Orchard Pine was never just one person doing wrong. It was a system built to trust no one, not even those who come to save lives. 3 days after Martha Green's death, the iron gate at Orchard Pine remained tightly shut, silent as if it hadn't just consumed a human life. But inside, the flame of justice had been lit, not by protests or blind rage, but through paperwork, through evidence, and a lawsuit written with words as sharp as a scalpel. Frank Green, the man who had just lost his wife after 50 years of marriage, sat motionless in the silent living room. Their wedding photo sat on the table like a smoldering reminder. This wasn't a death by fate. This was a death that could have been prevented if lives had been valued above gate codes and protocol. There were no more tears. Instead, Frank pulled out a large envelope filled with letters, warnings, and copies of regulations the HOA had sent to them over the years. Every sheet of paper was a record of inhumanity, and he intended to turn it into a weapon. He called Rachel Stein, a renowned attorney known for handling high-profile community lawsuits. Rachel was not only sharp-minded, but also harbored a deep disdain for self-appointed power structures that refused to accept responsibility. At their first meeting in her office, its walls lined with civil code excerpts and framed victories, Rachel only needed 15 minutes to review the file Frank brought. Her expression darkened when she reached the section describing Natalie being hit with a stun gun. "We're not just going to sue," she said. "We're going to dissect that entire system on the operating table of justice." Within the week, a formal lawsuit was filed with the Fulton County Superior Court in Georgia titled Frank Green versus Orchard Pine Estates HOA et al. The et al. included every member of the HOA board, security guard Derek Slater, and the private security firm contracted by the HOA. The legal basis: negligent homicide, obstruction of emergency medical personnel, and the establishment of an unlawful security apparatus. Rachel didn't just go after individual actions. She went after the structure itself. In the lawsuit, she described Orchard Pine as a microstate governed by a semi-professional council that had issued regulations beyond their legal authority, resulting in fatal consequences. She cited provisions from Georgia law requiring gated communities to provide emergency access for medical responders, something this HOA had failed to implement. One striking excerpt from the case file read, "We have evidence showing that security personnel were authorized to carry and use stun guns without appropriate licensing from the State Security Bureau. This is no longer mere negligence. This is systemic recklessness." The community quickly fractured. One group of residents backed Frank, signing a petition demanding the full removal of the HOA board and organizing an open town meeting just outside the gate, with banners reading, "You don't need a gate code to save a life." But another group, mostly allies of Karen, claimed Frank was blowing things out of proportion to cash in. Rachel knew she couldn't win just in court. She had to win in the court of public opinion. She reached out to the press, organized a media conference, and invited Natalie Brooks, still recovering from her arm injury, to speak. At that press conference, Natalie delivered a line that sent chills down the spine of millions. "I once dreamed of saving someone's life. Now I just dream of a day when no one has to die because of a gate code." A clip of her statement spread like wildfire. The online community, already boiling after Martha's death, now turned to action. A fundraising campaign to support Frank's legal fees was launched and raised over $250,000 within 48 hours. Meanwhile, the HOA board met in desperation. HOA President Victor Malone accused the media of blowing the situation out of proportion, insisting that Derek had just been doing his job. But one board member snapped back, "What kind of job allows you to shoot a medic in broad daylight?" The first cracks began to show. Some board members hinted at stepping down. Karen remained silent, but everyone knew her silence wasn't a sign of strength. It was a sign that a legal war was coming. Frank didn't want sympathy. He wanted the truth brought into the light. And when Rachel placed her hand on his shoulder in her office late one evening, she said only one thing: "We will not let Martha die in vain." I promised the legal battle had begun. And this time, the HOA could no longer hide behind locked gates. 6 months after Martha Green's death, Courtroom 3 at the Fulton County Courthouse had no empty seats. The hallway outside was packed with reporters, supporters, and Orchard Pine residents who came to witness something unprecedented: a homeowners association being sued for killing someone with its rules. Frank Green sat in the front row, his face resolute, clutching a photo of his wife. Beside him was attorney Rachel Stein, her eyes gleaming like a finely honed blade. Across from them sat the HOA board members, dressed in expensive suits, but visibly uneasy, including Victor Malone, the HOA president, who had once declared to the press, "Security comes before sentiment." In this moment, he was no longer the enforcer, he was the defendant. Rachel stepped to the podium with the composure of someone who had won dozens of major lawsuits. But today, she didn't recite charges in legal jargon. She told a story, not with the dry tone of statutes, but with the grief of a husband who lost his wife, and the anguish of a medic who was attacked while doing the right thing. "Your Honor," Rachel began, her voice steady and low, like the heartbeat of someone clinging to life. "This was not an accident. This was the inevitable result of a system that prioritized procedure over human life, and gave authority to those unfit to wield it." Natalie Brooks, her left arm still in a brace, took the stand as the first witness. She wore her EMS uniform, not for effect, but to emphasize one thing. That day, she wasn't a stranger. She was there to save a life. "I pointed to the ambulance. I pointed to the badge on my chest," Natalie said, looking straight at the jury. "I told him she was having a heart attack, and then I was shot, like an intruder." The air in the room turned to ice. A juror, an elderly woman in her 70s, quietly wiped away tears. James Carter, Natalie's colleague, followed with a slow, haunted voice. He described the moment he ran to find Natalie convulsing on the lawn, her medical bag flung aside, and Frank Green screaming as Martha took her final breath. "As medics, we learn to accept when a patient can't be saved," James said, "but we're not taught how to accept being blocked by the very people who should clear the path." Then came the turn of Derek Slater, the security guard who pulled the trigger. The room fell silent. No longer in uniform, he appeared as a trembling middle-aged man in a cheap suit. I was just following the rules," Derek stammered, eyes avoiding contact. "Who told you to use the stun gun?" Rachel asked. "No one. But the HOA said not to let anyone in without a code." "Even emergency personnel?" I thought they could be pretending." Rachel stepped forward and pulled out a printed still from a security camera. Natalie standing at the gate, dressed in a bright red EMS uniform, beside a fully lit ambulance. "Does she look like a criminal to you?" The jurors lowered their heads. The question needed no answer. When Victor Malone, HOA president, took the stand, Rachel didn't hold back. "You were the architect of the security policy, weren't you?" "Yes, to ensure resident safety." "Did you ever consider that such a policy could obstruct emergency response?" Victor remained silent. "Did you know the security firm lacked a license to carry stun guns?" "I didn't review every small detail." "Exactly, and a woman died because of that negligence." The jury was sent to deliberate after 2 days of testimony. The city held its breath. News outlets ran countdowns. The hashtag number sign, Justice for Martha, once again surged to the top of trending charts. And then, at 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday, the verdict was read. "We find Orchard Pine Estates HOA civilly liable for the death of Mrs. Martha Green and award $4 million in damages to the plaintiff." A collective breath burst into the room. Frank closed his eyes, gripping Rachel's hand tightly. Natalie embraced James for a long moment. And Victor Malone? He lowered his head, not in remorse, but in the quiet realization that the iron gate he had erected to control others had become the very bars that imprisoned him. Less than 24 hours after the verdict was announced, the domino effect had already begun rippling through the pristine white walls and decorative wooden fences of Orchard Pine Estates. The quiet homes, once ruled by fear of violating regulations, now echoed with whispers of rebellion. A final chapter had been written for the old board, but at the same time, a new one began with 2 words: rebuilding begins. The first changes came not from court orders, but from the conscience of the community. Residents who had once kept their heads down to avoid conflict began to speak out. The HOA office sign was taken down just 1 day after the ruling. Victor Malone, the man who once gave fiery speeches about governing through order, submitted his resignation and quietly listed his house for sale. A week later, no one saw him again near the artificial lake he had proudly inaugurated. The collapse of the former board didn't look like a coup. It resembled the implosion of a hollow structure from within. Those who once held power, Linda Hale, Douglas Grant, and several loyalists to Karen, resigned one by one. Some were condemned by public opinion, others simply couldn't lift their heads to walk the neighborhood anymore. The whispers on sidewalks turned into garage meetings, and soon a movement spread. A temporary council was formed, led by Arthur Jennings, a retired teacher and one of the first residents to publicly criticize the former HOA's security policies. By his side stood Helen Murphy, who had once defended Derek Slater, but after the trial publicly admitted her mistake. "I used to think we had to protect ourselves at all costs," she said at the new board's first meeting. "But I forgot that sometimes that cost is a human life." The new board's first action was to eliminate all gate code protocols for emergency responders. A red emergency button was installed at the guard post, so when an ambulance arrives, the gate opens instantly. A contact list for local fire departments and hospitals was updated and distributed to all residents. The old, harsh signs reading "No entry without code" were replaced with new ones: "Emergency vehicles always welcome." The security company's contract was terminated immediately. In its place, a neighborhood watch program was launched, run by the residents themselves in partnership with local police. No more body armor, no more stun guns, just neighbors looking out for one another with trust, not suspicion. But the impact didn't stop at the borders of Orchard Pine. National media picked up the story. Talk shows invited Frank Green, Natalie Brooks, and attorney Rachel Stein to speak. A federal investigation was launched into HOAs using unlicensed armed security. In at least 7 states, lawmakers introduced bills requiring all HOAs to guarantee emergency access. The New York Times ran the headline, "From Orchard Pine to Capitol Hill, one woman's death, one system's reckoning." Frank, though he declined most media appearances, continued working quietly. He used part of the settlement money to establish the Martha Green Foundation, awarding scholarships to young people pursuing careers in emergency medicine. "Martha always believed in the goodness of people," he said at the launch ceremony. "Now, she'll keep saving lives, in a different way." As for Natalie Brooks, though her arm hadn't fully healed, she returned to work at the ambulance station. She didn't say much, but every time an ambulance sped through Orchard Pine's open gate, no code needed, no guard in the way, she smiled. Not for the victory, but because someone, somewhere, would be saved in time, in a place where once a gate and a cold command had stood in the way. Orchard Pine was no longer a fortress. It had become a community, learning once more how to live and how to believe. Orchard Pine Estates is no longer a name that sends chills down people's spines. 6 months after the historic trial, the once gated, closed-off neighborhood has begun to open up, not just for ambulances, but for the very people who once remained silent. A place that once prioritized rules over compassion is now learning how to live again as a community, and it all started with one name, Martha Green. In the central lawn, once reserved for tents behind closed doors HOA meetings, now stands the newly established Martha Green Memorial Park. There is no flashy fountain, no ornate monument, just a simple wooden bench beneath a red maple tree with a plaque that reads, "She didn't die of a weak heart. She died because we forgot how to trust each other." That quote didn't come from a lawyer or a journalist. It came from Arthur Jennings, a longtime resident and the current president of the new council. At a community meeting, he stood up, voice trembling, and spoke those words as if confessing on behalf of everyone. And instead of protest, the room erupted in applause, not for him, but for the truth finally being spoken. Frank Green still lives in the 2-story home where he and Martha once planted wisteria along the porch. He didn't move away, as many had assumed. "I won't let them erase her memory," he said during the Memorial Park's dedication ceremony. His voice was low, but firm. Under his guidance, the Martha Green Scholarship Fund has already supported more than 10 medical students in its first year, young people who now carry her name to places where lives need saving faster than any gate code ever allowed. Natalie Brooks, after months of physical therapy and trauma counseling, has fully returned to work. She's no longer the medic who was tased and collapsed at the gate. She's now recognized as the spark behind a wave of HOA reforms sweeping across communities nationwide. In a speech to a class of new EMT trainees, she once said, "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who didn't turn away when I had every right to, and that changed everything." Change indeed has come. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact behind fences now invite each other for morning coffee. Children play on sidewalks without being scolded for disruptive noise. A resident once warned for planting non-compliant flowers is now in charge of maintaining the entire community park. Trust, an invisible but priceless thing, has returned. The media no longer crowds Orchard Pine the way it did in the aftermath of the lawsuit, but the story's influence hasn't faded. Martha's name now appears in legal conferences, public administration classes, and even in the drafting of new statewide emergency access legislation for HOAs. The Martha Green effect, as it's now known, has become a symbol for a vital lesson. When procedure outweighs humanity, disaster becomes inevitable. The community once fractured by fear is now stitched back together by small, everyday acts. A morning greeting, a gate left open, a nod between two people who once clashed in HOA meetings. And each time an ambulance passes through the now always open main gate, residents remember the day that same gate was locked and what it cost. On the first anniversary of Martha's passing, Frank stood quietly beneath the red maple tree. There was no speech, no crowd, just him, the bench, and a framed photo of Martha he gently placed beside it. He laid his hand on it and whispered, "Martha, you're still here, and now they're finally listening." Orchard Pine Estates will never forget the price it paid. But from that pain, it rediscovered something far more important: kindness. And in the heart of that park, in every blade of grass, every tree, and every child's laughter, lives the true legacy of Martha Green, a community no longer led by fear, but by humanity. The message and lessons from the Orchard Pine tragedy: when rules override. Humanity. The story of Martha Green's death isn't just an isolated incident. It's a powerful wake-up call about how we build and apply authority in our communities. When rules are enforced rigidly, without flexibility or compassion, they can become weapons, not only killing people, but eroding the very trust that holds a society together. The first and most urgent lesson is this: no rule should ever stand above a human life. In our modern world, we increasingly rely on systems, turning everything into policies, forms, and procedures. But when rules take precedence over basic human instinct, like opening a gate for an EMT, that's not governance anymore. That's the dehumanization of a community. The second lesson is about personal responsibility within collective systems. Derek Slater, the HOA security guard, claimed he was just following protocol. But history teaches us this: blind obedience is never an excuse for moral failure. Every individual has both the right and the duty to stop, think, and question when orders conflict with ethics. Third, this story highlights the power of speaking up. Frank Green could have stayed silent, swallowed his grief, and moved on. Instead, he chose to act, transforming pain into justice and loss into reform. His story reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing is a form of complicity. Real change begins when communities, like the residents of Orchard Pine, find the courage to rise together after tragedy. Finally, it's a lesson in healing. A neighborhood once ruled by fear, division, and mistrust can be reborn if it has the courage to confront its past, correct its mistakes, and rebuild with kindness. Healing doesn't come from tearing everything down, but from preserving what was good and reforming what was wrong, through empathy, dialogue, and shared action. In our own lives, we may not face gate codes or HOA boards, but we do live with invisible rules that make us hesitate to help, speak out, or question the norm. Let's learn to choose people over protocol, because sometimes that small choice is what saves a life, opens a door, or restores a little bit of faith in humanity. If this story made you reflect on the value of life and the fine line between law and humanity, then don't leave in silence. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Do you feel for Frank Green, outraged by what Natalie endured? Or do you have a different take on how the HOA acted? Don't hold back. Drop your thoughts in the comments, whether they're in support or in critique. Because sometimes your voice is the one that can move an entire community.